Thank you for opening the video. This is Don Ford, a Progressive Insider. I am here today for interview number 2 with Warren Mosler, creator of MMT. We are talking today about his book, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. If you caught our initial interview, it's a little longer than this one's going to be, but we cover just a huge spectrum of information in it so you can understand these individual frauds and how he explains them. So if you can, the book is The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy by Warren Mosler. Warren, thank you for being here again with me today.
Well, good to be here. Thanks.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. So, you really opened my eyes last time to this idea. I've heard it before. I understood what fiat currency was. I see all the concepts. But now, when I hear people say the phrase, but how are we going to pay for it at a federal level, I just about lose my mind.
Yeah.
This is real, right? We explained last time that the federal, taxes do not fund federal savings, which everyone says federal spending, but it's actually federal savings. That's correct, right?
That's not how I say it.
Okay, tell me how you say it.
But that's how a lot of other people say it, because the word fund is ambiguous. What I say is, every congressman knows how it works. They have to get money through taxing to be able to spend. And what they don't tax, they have to borrow from the likes of China, and we did that to our grandchildren, to be able to spend. So if they can't raise the money through taxing, and if nobody will lend the government the money, well, then it can't spend because the money isn't there. That's how every congressman is thinking, and every member of parliament and other forms of government. That's how the legislatures are thinking. Okay, now at the state level, at the local level, they're absolutely correct. But at the federal level, they've got it backwards. And that's what modern monetary theory is all about. It's sequence. They've got it backwards. Okay, and so in the book, I start with an example, I think it's the beginning, where let's say you were a waiter and you worked at a restaurant and you got all your tips and you had a whole pile of old $20 bills. And it was time to pay your taxes, so you walked into the federal government office with all these $20 bills and the IRS, and said, okay, here's my money for taxes. And they count them all out. They'd say, well, thank you very much. Thanks for helping pay for Afghanistan, coronavirus, readiness, preparedness, whatever else they're doing. And then as soon as you leave the room, they take those $20 bills, those old 20s, and they send them out to get shredded. And you can actually buy the shredded money in Washington. They sell them in little bags if you want. Okay, so, all right, well, who else does that? If somebody paid you with $20 bills, would you say thank you for now you pay your debt to me and now I'm going to go shred them? No, nobody does that.
And there is a logical reason for this, right? The logical reason.
Let me add one more thing.
Sure.
If the federal government is trying to borrow money by selling bonds, and you're the same waiter and you have a lot of extra 20s and you're going to go out and buy $1 million worth of government bonds with your 20s, you go out and buy the bonds. The government's borrowing those $1 million from you. You give them the $20 you just lent it. They'll pay you interest on that money. And as soon as they get it, they send it out to the shredder. Okay. Now, what sense does it make for them to be borrowing your money, paying interest, and then shredding it? Okay. So there's something else going on here. This is not what normal people do when they take money. And I'm just trying to make the point that the federal government's in a very different position. So let's say, who is the federal government like? What would be a good analogy, okay? So let's look at the football stadium. They sell a ticket to the Super Bowl, it costs $1,000. It gets sold to the next guy, it costs $5,000. By game time, somebody paid $10,000 to it. They go up to the stadium, they give the ticket to the man at the gate. He tears it up and throws it away. Okay. Now, nobody else would tear that ticket up and throw it away. It's worth
right. And there's a logical reason outside of economic theory for this process. So everyone who's watching this, why they're destroying the money. Well, we destroy money very normally because you want crisp, clean dollars in currency. So
why does the person taking the tickets at the Super Bowl tear up the ticket?
Well, of course, because it only has the value of the seat to that person as the concept.
Right, because it's used up.
Right.
It's at the end of its cycle. So the cycle starts with the stadium delivering the ticket, right, in exchange for dollars in this case. And it ends when that ticket's presented. in exchange for a seat, and then it's torn up and thrown away. The
And
same thing with the U.S. government. The cycle starts with the U.S. government paying somebody, and then when they take that money and use it to pay taxes, it's thrown away.
Right,
See,
right. I was just saying from a non-economic standpoint, outside of your argument for people that are watching, when you say the idea of destroying currency, that's a normal process that happens already, that actually occurs. And that's something that actually...
I'm just describing the reality.
Right. So, and this is really the point you're trying to make is more of a philosophical point of the government takes their money and they take it back, and then they can redistribute it however they want at that thing. Because it's not taking it back; it's just money on a spreadsheet, and it's about the scarcity idea.
You're using the word redistribute. That assumes
that's also wrong.
Yeah,
because there is no redistribution. There's only distribution.
Look. So what we pointed out, and everybody in the Federal Reserve knows, and everybody in the central bank. That's how I got familiar with this, because that's what I did. I dealt in the money market, starting with Bankers Trust in the 1970s, and people at the Fed and people at other central banks. And this is something everybody knows, that the dollars that can be used to pay taxes or to buy bonds come from the government. The same way that the ticket for the football stadium comes from the stadium. It doesn't come from anyone else. Yeah.
Do you think it'd be easier for people to understand if you tried something like, because when I've been explaining this to people, and I come from the perspective of, well, they're the bond issuer, and whoever the bond issuer doesn't need their bonds back to pay for things. And it's almost like this is a form of bond issue economics, where the bond issuer is in control of the whole process. And I think that's where we need people to kind of reassess their mindset over what's going on here, because it's all
but why take something complex like a bond issuer? Why not say an airline with frequent flyer miles? It hands out the miles first, and then it collects them later. I've been using that example with people, and it seems to confuse people because the commercialism aspect of it's just it's like a subtle thing. It should work. It should technically is a functionally accurate idea. But when I actually explain it to people, they get confused. If everything has to come from a source.
Of course.
And the source has to get the thing out there before it can get it back.
Right.
The movie theater doesn't collect the ticket first and then sell it.
Right. Do you think?
Nor can the government collect dollars first and then spend them, because they come from the government. Look, if you look at any dollar bill, who signs it? Somebody from the government.
Do you think this is an argument to lowering the average American's tax liability at the same time?
Okay, let's just finish with this for a second.
Sure.
I mean, does anybody think? Can't people understand that the dollars to pay taxes come from the government?
They do when you explain it the right way.
Just like that. Just that one simple sentence.
Yeah, no, when you explain it the right way, in that simple sentence, it's actually very effective.
If you have a dollar bill in your pocket, where did it come from?
Why would the government need your money to pay for things with its own money?
Well, first question is, if you got a $20 bill in your pocket, where did it come from?
Right.
If it's not counterfeit.
Well, didn't they used to say...
Dollars that don't come from the government are called counterfeit. We have penalties for that. Everybody knows these things come from the government.
Didn't they used to say property of the U.S. Treasury on them or something? They don't anymore, but they used to have some...
Whatever they used to say or didn't say, they come from the government.
Right.
They could say Bozo the Clown on them, but they come from the government.
Well, that was a dreadful election when Bozo won, but here we are trying to take back 2020.
So look, the first thing everybody in central banks know is that the dollars first come from the government. The euro come from the government. The yen come from the government. They know that the private sector can't create them. Otherwise, it's called counterfeit.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly logical thing. But I think when we're explaining this to people and they're trying to understand it, I found that the average American really wants to see how is it going to affect them, right? And that's the conversation. And so the first thing we're talking about with the first deadly innocent fraud is that they must raise funds through taxes or borrowing in order to spend. In other words, government spending is limited by its ability to tax or borrow, which is not true.
In other words, the dollars to pay taxes come from the government. They don't come from the private sector.
Right. I was just reading your actual directly from your book.
Right. Now, President Obama said that. He said, look, the dollars come from the government, and he got shouted down. And everyone said, no, real wealth comes from the private sector. The government only transferred it. And he backed down because there's an ambiguity there between real wealth and dollars. Dollars come from the government. Real wealth is a different thing.
this theory is an archaic concept based on when our dollar was backed by something briefly, right? Like when the dollar was backed by gold and silver.
What theory? What theory?
The theory that taxes do pay for spending, or there's a limited amount of financing from the government, is like an archaic theory from when we were gold and silver backed, or is it just something they made up at some point?
First, let me just say it doesn't matter. We can go through every example in history, and I can do that, but today could be a different story. So some of it is based on that, yes. But what the confusion is that what does allow government spending are tax liabilities.
Right.
Okay, not the tax payment. Once there are taxes in place, then people need the dollars to pay the tax. Once there's a football game announced, then people need the tickets to see the game. Okay, so it's a perfect analogy. So once there's a tax, let's say on your house, let's keep it simple. Let's say we had only a property tax on your house. You now need dollars as a homeowner, as a renter, the guy's renting from you, or else you're going to lose your house. And you don't need yen, and you don't need, pounds. You need dollars. You don't need gold. You need dollars somehow. If you can sell something to get dollars, fine, but you need dollars. So that the fact that the government causes the economy as a whole to need dollars means that suddenly people are selling things and they want dollars in exchange. They don't want gold. You can't sell anything. People don't want gold. They want dollars. I've had a gold coin in my hand. I go into a store and I go, oh, we don't take that. We just want dollars. So what are they going to do with it? Okay, so people need dollars because there are tax liabilities in place. So first the government puts a tax in place. Okay, I haven't collected anything yet. Now people go out to work to get dollars. The government can now hire them to be public service people in government, the military, the legal system, public education, okay? Then they get paid, and then they pay the tax. That's the actual sequence.
Yeah, but does that process need to exist anymore is what I'm saying.
Yes, it does exist continuously.
No. Does it need to exist anymore?
Yes. Okay, it needs to exist. The dollar is simply a tax credit. It needs to exist for the dollar, for the yen, for the euro.
No, I meant the tax liability that the average American citizen faces, like the average American worker. Does that
it doesn't
need to exist?
Yeah,
I'm not sure it does anymore.
Look, as a point of logic, there has to be tax liability. It doesn't have to be everybody needs to be taxed. In theory, only one person needs to be taxed. Then he's willing to sell things. And if other people wants what he's trying to sell, then they need dollars too. That process is called monetization, where once some people are taxed, suddenly everybody's looking for that thing that that person wants because he's trying to sell things. He's trying to sell his house and he needs it for tax, the money to pay his taxes. And so other people need dollars or they can't buy his house. And that process is called monetization, and it happens very quickly. It takes about an hour to monetize an economy once you've got tax liabilities in place. Everybody gets it, and they always have. It's not a difficult thing.
Does a tax liability have to come in theory from the government in the sense of moving currency, right? Because this is what we're talking about. I'm going to kind of make a jump here because I'm really curious about this. I'm not sure if this is a question I'm asking right, but when it comes to we're going to come back around to this. I got to reform this question. I got a question here that has to do with tax liability that I'm still a little confused about. So let's
let's go back to the first fraud. The fraud is that everybody in Congress thinks they need to get dollars to be able to spend. When the truth is, the way it actually works is that the economy needs dollars to pay the tax. It's completely the opposite.
Say that one more time for me, please.
Okay, everybody in Congress thinks they need to get dollars to be able to spend. When actually what's going on is the economy needs dollars to be able to pay the government's tax liabilities, to be able to pay their taxes. Because if the government just taxed and didn't spend, there'd be no way anybody could pay any taxes.
Right, because the money has to go out again.
Because it comes from the government.
Right.
So if there was just a $4 trillion tax with zero government spending, then the system's going to be deficient, $4 trillion on its payment of taxes, on day one. After a while, there's savings built up, which we'll get into. But
yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with in theory. Is like we're in a process where the system's been going on for a long time, so we've developed all these forms of savings that are happening.
Yeah. So the only way that people could pay their taxes is to drain their savings. Okay, so if the government had $4 trillion of taxes and no spending, everybody would have to drain all their savings just to pay their taxes. The economy is in total collapse. That's called the Depression. And after a year or two, all the savings is gone.
And that's why they lower tax liability in those situations,
right,
like across the country.
Right. Or increase spending. Yeah.
Right. Those are the only two answers in a depression situation.
Right.
Okay. I'm getting this.
Yeah,
I hope my watchers are getting this too. It's a little complicated. You got to hear it a bunch of times over and over again. It's also hard for people to understand how it interacts with them day to day, which I think we're going to start getting to in this process. I feel like we're getting there, how it affects people.
Yeah. Well, the central bankers and the finance ministers I talk to have at least as much difficulty with it as you do. So don't feel bad.
Thank you. Well, well, they should know it better than me. And I think this is also why we see certain economic managers take over things, and they try to use economic policies that are not for federal governments, and you just see these collapses of systems and structures, and it's just this kind of like, we should know this answer now.
So the big contribution that MMT made is that government has to spend first before the economy can pay its tax. Government has to spend first before it can borrow anything, before the bonds can be purchased by the economy. You've got to do, the way they say it in the central bank, and I'll just say it, is you can't do a reserve drain without first doing a reserve add. You can't take something out of the system without putting it in first, because it comes from the government. You have to put it in first.
You can't drain an empty tank.
Right. Right. So if your account's at zero, they can't deduct anything for payment. They have to make a credit to your account before they can make a debit. And that's what's called offsetting operating factors. And that's what the Fed does on a continuous basis during the day to make sure they're not, trying to get blood from a stone. They're not trying to draw it out before they put it in.
But that's almost similar to our own economics, our own bank accounts, in the sense that we can't spend our own money until we take money out, until we put money in it first. And the federal government's the same way, but it's different because they get their money from themselves.
Well, no, the federal government's looking at the economy. The central bankers are looking at the economy. They say, look, we can't take money out of the economy until after we put it in.
Right.
So they're going to sell $20 billion worth of bonds. Nobody can pay for that until they put $20 billion in.
This is where austerity comes in as a concept then, right? Like austerity is choosing not to put money into the economy and still taking money out of it. And that leads to a
Right. When they think they got to take the money out to be able to put it in, they got it backwards.
Oh, this is what comes in your story about Italy, right? Because Italy, they realized the rate was different and they could change this thing because they couldn't default on it. And so
because they had to put lira in before they could take it out. Where they all think that you have to take it out before you can put it in. Congress thinks they have to take dollars out of the economy before they can put them in. It's backwards.
I just want to say something to everyone watching real fast. If you look at Warren's book, he explains how he basically saved the country of Italy's financial market on accident. It's pretty amazing read. You should definitely check it out because we could tell the story right now, but it's not the same. His book is available on his website. If you want to take a look at it, it's Warren Mosler. It's MoslerEconomics.com, and you can always just Google Warren Mosler and 7 Deadly Innocent, and it pops up instantly.
And it's you download it. It's free online. There's no charge.
It's free. You can't beat that. So
and it's short.
It is short.
And it's not technical.
Well, maybe not for you, sir.
I didn't say you didn't have to work a little, but it's not technical.
Yeah, I did read it in one night, and I
good.
I definitely go back. I definitely go back to look at it every now and every so often. But you have some amazing stories in there to explain why people should be hearing you. So I just really take a second to look at that. But let's keep going. So the question I was asking, you made a point. You said technically taxation could be one person. We could just tax Jeff Bezos into the ground.
Yeah.
Theoretically, and he would just need to produce more materials in order to maintain as well. Which kind of brings me down to the idea of, you hear this Republican talking point, that taxation is theft, right? That's what they say is this concept. And it's sort of, I don't like the idea that
they're not wrong. Because what we're doing is provisioning government. And the real tax is paid when, look, everybody's in the private sector until government comes along. If you have no government, you're not in government. Now government wants soldiers, okay? Government wants public health workers. Government wants a legal system. It's got to get people to shift from the private sector to the public sector. Okay, it's taking those people away. They can no longer be farmers. They can no longer build cars. They can no longer do medical research at the university, whatever they were doing. Okay, and so there's a certain number of people. And if you put them all in government and there's nobody left to do what the private sector is doing, we're short that many goods and services.
which is why we do public funding for private organizations to some degree, because that's stepping outside the government but still using the government's money.
Well, it's not so, what I'm talking about is not money. I'm talking about the real resources, the people, the materials. If the government, if we sent all the steel to the government, there'd be no steel left for anything else in the economy.
Right, which is what we see in like communist countries happen, where they'll control everything in one whole.
Yeah, then there's no private sector at all, and you know, okay. And so, what I'm saying though is the government is collective action, presumably for public purpose. In our case, by majority rule, so to speak, some kind of representative government, to shift resources from private to public domain for the common good. You know, okay, look, if we have a military, we're going to have a couple million fewer people doing private sector work, but we're not going to lose a war. So is it worth it? Okay, you have to decide, does that serve public purpose? Do we want a legal system? Do we want to have contracts we can enforce with each other? All right, we've got to shift more people out of the private sector into the public sector. Give up. We're going to have fewer stockbrokers calling us every day because we're going to have a smaller private sector. Right. They're going to be judges and lawyers. And
well, this also comes down to the establishment concept. Like, people are always like, I'm against the establishment. I'm like, as long as there are resources to distribute, there will be an establishment. And what you're describing is that concept that people talk about a lot, essentially.
Yeah, you need, you know, I consider myself in the academic sense, libertarian, I'm not politically aligned with most libertarians.
By the way, I caught that on our first interview.
Yeah, okay. And in that, I see government as public infrastructure for public purpose. And then I define what is needed for government, public purpose. You know, we go through that process. I think we should have public education. I think we should have public health, Medicare for all. But these are all what I think is public infrastructure that serves public purpose and makes the people who are not in government that much better. I think the gains by shifting for the private sector, by shifting that many people in the government, are net positive. Okay, and they're net positive for the entire country by doing that. And so, so I don't want the public sector any larger than necessary to net enhance, you know, this real standard of living.
Well, there is the catch-22, and I think what you're saying, and I hope I got this right, is that we don't want to put too much into the public sector because you want a perfect balance, because that's what you talk a lot about, is getting this balance of not too much of anything. And we also have a lot of fraud in our federal government.
Yeah.
So whenever we have too much of it, then it ends up just being loose stuff going out. And as much as we do have unlimited money, people talk about when they drive this idea, there's still a balance that has to be achieved with how much is out there and the demand, the scarcity to keep production up.
Yeah, look, there's fraud everywhere. State, local government, private sector, it's full of fraud. I mean, we have a major problem with, you know, older people being defrauded by all kinds of schemes, right? Like the whole world is faced with continuous fraud. You know, it's a never-ending battle.
Yeah. Well, I think that my big takeaway from this idea is, as much as all this idea is really important, my idea of how we would get this to people, to have them understand how important it is that this can lead directly to lowering the individual American workers' tax liability, because the tax liability that drives America is not dependent on the workers' liability. It's
all right. So look, the unemployment is the evidence that the government has not spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save. Now I can explain where that comes from. But what that means is, if you're faced with unemployment, what you have to do is either lower taxes or increase public spending. And the unemployment is created by government. It's the government's fault. You can say it's a mistake, but it's still done by government, okay? And so if you want, I can get into how that comes about.
Well, we can definitely talk about that.
Okay.
I mean,
but I'll let you lead with the questions.
Well, I don't think I understand this well enough to make a question for you, sir, because you're talking about something that is totally new for me. So you know what we're gonna do? We are in uncharted territory for Don Ford right now, and I just want you to explain this to me right now.
All right. So look, here's how. So we start off with the government, and we'll start off with a government that wants a military, a legal system, that needs people out of the private sector. So how do you get them into government? Well, you can like have an army of people who want to, you know, loot, you know, wherever you conquer and take slaves back like they used to do, and run your government that way. You could do what the British did when they wanted people in the Navy. They'd go into the bars late at night and haul away drunks, and they'd wake up as British sailors. So, but we pretend to be more civilized. And what we do is, number one, we establish a tax liability. And for this example, let's just look at a real estate tax, right? So we don't have to get into the nuance of how all the taxes work. But they do all work. If you look hard enough, they work in the same way. So first we start with a tax liability on everybody's house and all dwellings. And so that creates an economy that needs dollars to pay the tax, because all the dollars to pay the taxes on all those houses can come only from the government. So we start with a tax liability. That creates people who are looking for jobs that pay in dollars. That creates farmers looking to sell their tomatoes in exchange for dollars. That includes, and so it monetizes the economy. Now there's this great need for dollars. Now the government can do something they could not do before there was a tax liability. Because before there was a tax liability, nobody even knew what the dollar was. The dollar was invented, in this example, as the thing you need to pay your taxes. I call it the tax credit, the thing you need to pay your taxes. Okay, so they say, look, there's a tax liability and it's in this new thing called the dollar, and that's what you need to pay your taxes so you don't lose your house and your car and everything else. And so now you have people willing to sell their labor, go to work, and earn dollars. Okay, people looking for paid work are what we call unemployed. If you're looking for paid work, then you count it as unemployed. If you're looking to volunteer for the American Cancer Society, you're not unemployed.
Which the government does not classify it that way, which is really important, right? The unemployment numbers are a very specific metric that are not actually representative of true unemployment. Yeah,
but what they are is always people looking for paid work. It's just different categories of people looking for paid work. So, and they list all the categories. And the headline is a very narrow category, but the categories they list beyond that get broader, and they are much larger than the headline unemployment. So it is what it is. Okay, so the purpose of the tax is to create unemployment. It creates people who need dollars to pay the tax. Those people we define as unemployed. Okay, the government then hires whoever it wants to serve in the army, to serve as judges and lawyers, and to be public health and public education. Okay, and so let's say the tax created 10 million unemployed people. And then the government only hired 5 million people. Like, what sense does that make?
Yeah, no, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so that means that the tax created more unemployed than the government wanted to hire. So it means the tax is too large, or they should hire more people, one or the other. It's not what anybody would logically decide to do. Okay, now let me give you an example where this actually happened in simple terms, which was when the British went into Africa to grow coffee. They wanted the people in Africa who didn't have a monetary system to work on the coffee plantations. And they didn't care anything about money or anything like that. They were busy leading their lives and hunting and fishing and teaching school to their kids and picking berries and whatever else you have to do to live in Africa, build houses and huts or whatever they were living in, and doing perfectly fine before the British got there. Well, how does the British get them into the coffee plantation? They put a tax on everybody's house in something nobody had, the crown. They just made up a currency, piece of script. That was the tax credit. You all have to pay 100 crown a month, or we've got the military, we're going to burn down your house. It was called a hut tax, H-U-T, a hut tax. You pay the 100 crown a month or we're going to burn down your hut. Everybody says, all right, well, we don't want to get our huts burned down. What do we have to do to get this 100 crown a month? Well, you got to come down and work at the coffee plantation. And we'll pay 10 crown a day or whatever. They had a wage, 1 crown a day. They named the wage. Okay, it's their cut. They have to tell them what they have to do to get the money. People showed up at the coffee plantation, earned the crowns, and then they could go back and pay their tax. So notice the tax liability came first, 100 crown a month. Okay. After that, they had unemployment. All of a sudden, there was no unemployment. Now there are all these people looking for paid work to avoid getting a house burned down. They show up for work, they get paid, and then they pay the tax. And the British were able to move substantial portions of the population from, what their real life had been to working on a coffee plantation for the British, which was, let's call it the public sector in this case. Okay, and it was coercive. The public sector enforced it with a hut tax, with the military to burn your house down. Now, if you looked at the total tax, it might have been, 100,000 crown. They put put a total tax on for 100,000 crown and then only give people jobs to earn 90,000 and then go burn down somebody's hut. Why would they do that? Okay, that's
Yeah,
not what
that's like intentionally making someone fail. It's the opposite of what they're
right.
looking to produce coffee. The brain
Right. You got it.
a byproduct of the coffee production not happening to drive scarcity and demand. Now here's
exactly
for you.
The crown's not worth anything to them. So if people were still trying to show up for work, let's say the tax was 100,000 and people were trying to show up for work to earn crown, they'd hire anybody who showed up as long as they weren't totally
they would have to like start
insane.
sharing huts between people and grouping crowns in order to get over that.
Well, they wouldn't do it. That wasn't the purpose. They weren't there to be disruptive. They're there to grow coffee. They wanted, okay. And so what they would do is they'd hire anybody who showed up, okay, and they would then pay the people who would then pay the tax. Well, invariably, more people would show up. They'd pay more than the tax. So if the tax was 100,000, people might show up and earn 110,000. Okay, and they'd always spend more than they collected. They'd have to. They can't spend less than they collected. It'd be stupid. They'd have to go burn somebody's house down. What's the point? Okay, if they had more people than they wanted, they might lower the tax, right?
Which is where I'm going to go with this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, but look at the sequence. First the tax, then people show up for work, then they get paid, then they pay the tax. They understood that they didn't need to collect the tax to be able to pay the people at the plantation. They knew they had a big box of crowns and they would pay the people who would then, use it to pay the tax. And at that point, once they paid, they could throw the old crown away and use new ones. It's the same as today.
It's a pretty abusive system, even when it's used like properly.
Yeah, and it still is. Okay, it's a coercive, mean-spirited system even today.
It is. At its start, right? At its start, it has to be because there's some sort of coercive nature to get people to go from what they're doing here to what they're doing here. But we are in a system that's been going for hundreds of years already.
Yeah.
And taxation is more than just like the scarcity demand that taxation creates comes from the normal goods and services we need to survive now.
No, it comes from the tax every day.
The thing is, I don't agree with you.
Then if you work your logic through, you'd have what's called an infinite regression that can't begin anywhere.
We're not talking about starting. We're talking about finishing.
I know. Well, look, you can go to New York City. Remember when they had subway tokens?
Yeah.
And you could watch it. You could say, "Oh, I see what happens. They're collecting the tokens and then they're selling them." And you could see it because it's already in motion. Okay.
Right.
But that what's actually happening is they're selling the token first and then collecting it because they come from the city.
We actually have a really good example of this now with modern app games. So modern app games transfer your money into diamonds, and then the diamonds get used for whatever in some sort of currency. And it's that same circular logic that's happening at the beginning that is it's also the same thing we do with delegates, ironically, with the democratic process for some reason.
Yeah. But if you look at any country where tax collection ceases, suddenly the government can't do tax collection. That currency goes to zero immediately.
I'm not saying that tax collection should stop. I'm saying that the thing that I'm saying is, like, for me, for example, I am earning under the $60,000, vastly under the $60,000 a year. Or let's say I'm actually probably like 35 on a really, really good day with my wife. And this puts me into a situation of constant scarcity and below a lot of tax liability.
Right.
So, my thing is, like, the way I'm seeing this is that if someone is earning less than $100,000 a year, there's enough tax liability in their life to drive scarcity, to keep them spending money and to keep their money in the system. That taxation, other than state-run property taxes, now I'm understanding state taxes are actually really important because states don't produce their own money and they actually use that money for state spending. That's correct? Unless they get money from the federal government.
That's correct.
So your local taxes, your state taxes are actually very important, but your federal taxes, from a worker standpoint, not a corporate standpoint, from a worker standpoint, don't necessarily serve the same purpose because we have so many examples of loose taxes from corporations that push scarcity and drive the dollar anyways. I mean, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, you're right up to the point where you say push scarcity and drive the dollar. That becomes disconnected from the macro understanding. Okay. What we have is a massive distributional issue, where people aren't getting paid enough. Because when I grew up in the 60s, that's the 1960s, the husband could work, make $3 or $4 an hour, support the family, send the kids to school. The wife could stay home with the kids. You had a car, you had a refrigerator, you had what was available, you had electric, you had running water and everything else, nice plumbing, and nice roads and good sidewalks for the kids. Okay, you had all that with just the husband working. Okay, now productivity has gone way up. The average output per worker is probably 10 times or more than it was back then. Okay, yet today, the husband and wife both working can barely make it. Okay, so we've got a massive distributional issue going on right now. And it's why I've started promoting this understanding, because what do I care if people understand how the money works? I mean, I'm not making any money on this, except for the 100,000 you're paying me, but I normally don't charge for this.
Yeah, I think that this is all about trying to improve the quality of life of the average person. And when we talk about,
well, so if it wasn't, what's happened is the bar's been lowered so far that, you know, small little things, and people are like dancing in the streets. I mean, if unemployment in Italy goes from 10 to 9.9, it's like, you know, celebration. And in the United States, if somebody gets a 3% raise from a below subsistence level, you know, pay, it's like celebration. We've set the bar so low, people have forgotten what a good economy is like and what we're capable of doing if we understand the monetary system.
And at the same time, these corporations that are avoiding their tax liability are just being able to pool resources outside of the system. And that seems like we talked about.
No. Look, a corporation is just a pass-through. If they have to pay more taxes, their prices go up. It's a competitive, relatively competitive environment. Not all.
I gotta argue with that, because that's not. I agree with that theory in the sense, but only in that we don't see that actually what is happening. I mean,
well, if it's not. If a corporation is not in that kind of a competitive situation, then they need to be regulated.
And that's exactly right. So this is what I'm talking about. So like landlords and where.
So don't confuse a failure of government to regulate with something else.
Okay, that's a fair way to. That's a good way. I can go with that. Yeah.
Okay.
The thing that I'm seeing right now that I'm going to use as an example that's a big deal in California is rent control is becoming a big deal here. Yeah. And I was in line to run for county committee because I'm on the ballot here in California. And I was talking to some people, and there were homeowners who were running, and they were like, if my tenant makes an extra $1,000, they get a raise, I should be able to charge them that $1,000 a month. And I went, that's the craziest shit I've ever heard. And then someone behind me, they're a Republican arguing with me, and then some guy chimes up and goes, no, I believe that too. And I go, well, there are a lot of Republicans. And he goes, no, I'm a Democrat. And this is just an example of how we have to regulate these industries so that they can't do things like this. Now, this is extended into things like Apple and all these other corporations that have figured out how to get as much money as they can from the average consumer. And this becomes its own form of taxation. Even though it is voluntary to choose to be a part of that, you don't really get a choice. Like, I have to have a smartphone, and I got.
Okay, so my proposal to deal with the rent issue, and you've got to think it through, because on the surface, like the income tax, it might not sound, make sense, but is if we just replaced all transaction taxes, no more income taxes, no more sales taxes, we replaced it all with a property tax. Let's say it's 10% of the value of your property. So if you've got $1 million house, you got to pay $100,000 a year. Okay, if you've got a $50,000 house, it'd be $5,000 a year. If you're renting it, you'd have to get $400 a month to cover the tax plus whatever you're going to get for rent. So number one, that would tend to keep property prices lower. It would keep a lot of speculation out. It would keep people from having second and third homes, because it becomes prohibitively expensive to do that.
Your liability goes through the roof from having this.
Yeah, if you live if you're a non-resident and you buy a house in the U.S. just to use 2 weeks a year in Los Angeles, and depopulate the city that way and drive up rents, you're going to be paying, 10% of your property value every year. It becomes absurd to do that, and so. But
that's actually a big issue here in LA, by the way, that people are stashing their money in property because the property becomes more, but it drives up the market for the people.
Actually but if you do what I said, then that goes away. Okay,
because their liability is too high, and only it's no longer a profitable venture because it has to be the liability has to be higher.
Now, for the average working person, the liability is still high, but he and his wife don't have any income taxes. They don't have any sales taxes. And so it's pretty much the same number of dollars, but they're going to wind up ahead. And I'll go into reasons for that, pretty far ahead, even though the tax on the house is much higher.
It's much
And
like
so
the Medicare for All proposal right now that's saying, yes, your taxes are going to go up, but your overall costs will go down. So you'll spend less money.
Right.
But you'll spend less.
And your overall costs going down are taxes elsewhere because they're just going to be abolished. Okay, they won't be there anymore. And additionally, the compliance costs of all these transactions taxes, income tax, sales tax. A friend of mine at the University of Chicago, who can't get more mainstream than that, estimated that's like 15% of GDP. So the real wealth of the country goes up by 15%. And it all goes to the lower income people because the upper income people don't consume more just because there is more. The lower income do because they're faced with shortages. And so it increases the general welfare of people who are living, let's say, below the maximum, okay, by 20, 25 or 30%. It was a huge number.
And that's ultimately the goal, it seems like, of MMT, to get this theory out there, because right now, these are all used in oppressive manners to hold people back and to limit them and hinder them. And this is something that is used to, that how do they do the bank bailout? Well, this is how they did it. And we could just as easily pay for all the social programs we want, as long as that money is going. Now, correct me on this. I'm trying my best.
Yeah, well, you got to avoid moral hazard.
Okay. You got to avoid moral hazard?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you give more Social Security to people who are over 65 or 70 or whatever, let's say you made the minimum $2,000 a month or $2,500. That doesn't mean people in their 30s are not going to work because someday they're going to get $2,500 a month. So there's no moral hazard in that. But if you give people who are in their 30s enough money so they don't have to work, now there's a moral hazard. They might not work, in which case we have no production, we have nothing.
Right.
So you got to be very careful.
Of UBI that is kind of making its rounds right now, and universal origin.
So again, you got to be very careful of the moral hazard issues. Okay, is the point I was trying to make when you start talking about whether you can afford this program or not. Yes, it's not about the money; it's about the resources, but it's also to make sure you don't undermine the supply side. That you cut out you have incentives not to produce. You got to be very careful of that because you can very quickly get to nothing if you get that wrong.
So there is really a psychological element of the consumer and making them drive money and comparative to the corporate element that almost I could see how people don't want to deal with the psychological element. You
have to look at the corporate element as a pass-through to someone.
Right.
Okay? And you have to do it very differently. And you have to realize that if you don't have a competitive environment, you have to have regulation. And then you can show how it makes no sense for corporations to pay for healthcare. For that to be a marginal cost of production. It should be done by the state. Okay, once you have single payer, you lower the Medicare age to 0, make it free for everybody. It's got to be state sponsored, and that corporations should pay taxes. It just creates huge costs for corporations, that real costs that take away from people's lives. And again, if you've got some form of competition, you're not going to. That's how you eliminate the price gouging. If you don't, you have to regulate it to eliminate the price gouging. Those are your only two choices. And you don't have to allow the corporation. Corporate status is a gift. It's not some right. You have to apply to be a corporation. You get limited liability.
Yeah, they're trying to limit their personal liability when they form a corporation, and that is
sure. And the state has to make sure that it serves public purpose to give limited liability. And if it doesn't, you don't do it. And let them exist the way they used to exist with personal liability. That changed a lot for these major financials to have unlimited liability, okay, rather than personal liability. And there was no sense, there is no sense as to whether or not that serves public purpose anymore. I never hear that argument. A few guys, smart guys like Rohan Gray, who's a lawyer, he'll make that argument, but you don't read about it or hear it anywhere.
Yeah, this is actually something that I talk about in reference to public services in the police and stuff like that. Do the police serve the people anymore, or do they serve for taxation purposes only? And that's sort of the same conversation. And so you said the exact words were, do they serve
public purpose?
Public purpose. Okay.
If the public is going, if we're going to collectively give them the gift of limited liability, let's make sure that it makes sense for the country to have corporations with limited liability. Let's have that discussion. It's not, nobody ever has it.
Right. And that's where and I always get into the taxation. We talked about this a little bit, and I don't want to get into this. We're going to have to wrap this up because we can only have these so long at a time.
Okay.
I wanted to talk about, and I kind of still want to keep wrapping up on this issue because I'm a little confused on it, because I feel like part of this tax liability forces corporations to put their money in an offshore account, but that actually seems like it's really destructive to the balance of the system we're trying to achieve.
Well, it's a good thing, because if a corporation doesn't spend its income, that means we can have lower taxes or more public services.
But doesn't that still have to be somehow being used in somehow making its way to the American worker?
Sure, lower taxes. Okay. Lower taxes or have more public services.
But that's okay. Well, we'll get into this another time. I think I see a couple of issues there we can talk about, but you're probably just doing a great job explaining them all to me so far that I'm sure we'll get where we're going. So Warren, thank you so much. Warren Mosler again. You can get his book at moslereconomics.com. Look at all this stuff. Just so you know, it is called The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, and it explains how MMT works, which is I don't even know if we're using the right phrase. Works. It's a theory. It is a function, and it's really important that people understand it, especially if you're going to be out there supporting complex social, Medicare for all these other things. People say, how are we going to pay for it? We're going to pay for it the same way we pay for everything else. We're going to go and write a check. It's
reasonably short and it's free online. So just get out there and take a look.
Thank you so much, Warren, for being with me. This has been Don Ford with Progressive Insider. We will have more of these videos coming up, and there's so much to check out. So please have a look at it, and we will be